Welcome to the Southern Ohio Synod podcast. I am Pastor Katie Kerrigan, and I serve as the Director for Evangelical Mission and Assistant to the Bishop for Generosity, which means I help congregations discern their mission in the world as they jump on God's bandwagon and do God's work in their communities. I also help congregations with stewardship and about how life-giving it is to live out of a culture of generosity. I'm so glad you have joined us for our episode today.
On a trip to New York City in mid-February, I went to see the musical Wicked. This musical is the prequel to the acclaimed Wizard of Oz. In the musical, we encounter the characters of Glinda, known as the Good Witch of the South, and Elphaba, known as the Wicked Witch of the West. Elphaba attempts to perform acts of witchcraft in order to bring about good for those who matter to her. In each case, her good deeds don't lead to the positive results for which she had hoped. Reaching her limit of good actions and the accompanying bad consequences, she sings about trying one more act of goodness by saying, "It will just be one more disaster I can add to my generous supply." She sings, "No good deed goes unpunished. No act of charity goes unresented. No good deed goes unpunished. That's my new creed. My road of good intentions led where such roads always lead. No good deed goes unpunished." She goes on to sing, "Since I cannot succeed, I promise no good deed will I attempt to do again, ever again. No good deed will I do again." So what happens when you do all the right things and you don't get the good results for which you had hoped? A spiritual crisis occurs. This spiritual crisis is a crisis of meaninglessness. We want our words and actions to mean something, to make something good happen. If we do all the right stuff and don't get those results, then we feel that the acts are meaningless. They have no purpose. I want to lift this spiritual crisis to you as listeners of this podcast on discipleship, because I think it captures for many millennials the spiritual crisis that they face. So this podcast will consider the message of the church to those who are in the spiritual crisis of meaninglessness. The three fundamental spiritual crises are the fear of death, the fear of guilt, and the fear of shame. The way the church speaks to those having the spiritual crisis from the fear of death is different than the way the church speaks to those in the midst of the spiritual crisis of guilt. Likewise, when the spiritual crisis is meaninglessness, the way the church speaks to them in that crisis needs to be different than if the spiritual crisis was the fear of dying or the fear of guilt. Let's take a quick look at those three spiritual crises. Paul Tillich, in his book, The Courage to Be, identifies three fundamental anxieties. Those anxieties I call fears, and they are the fear of death, the fear of guilt, and the fear of shame. The fear of death is the fear and anxiety over the end of our own lives or the end of the lives of those that we love. The fear of guilt is the fear and anxiety of doing that which is wrong, immoral, or harmful to others and to ourselves. The fear of shame is the fear and anxiety of doing the right thing and not getting the good results what we expected. So the fear of death leads to self-preservation. Self-preservation is investing in what we think will protect us from all possible harm. The fear of guilt leads to self-justification. Instead of owning the failure and repenting, we make excuses for why we did what we did. And commonly, we blame others for our failures. The fear of shame leads to self-righteousness. Now, self-righteousness is a claim of what I, others, and the world must be like. It is typically lived out by arbitrary norms based on false assumptions. It makes a demand on the self and others to live into those norms. Those who don't are seen as wrong or bad people. So when I don't live up to those norms, I conclude that I'm a failure and I'm a bad person. Self-righteousness is rooted in feeling shame. Now, shame is different than guilt. Guilt comes from having done something wrong. Shame is doing the right thing and getting the wrong results, such as that about which Elphaba sings. Lewis Smedes, in his book Shame and Grace, articulates the power of shame in shaping how a person thinks about themselves and acts accordingly. And I think that each of these behaviors could be considered a form of self-righteousness. One of those behaviors is over-responsibility. This form of self-righteousness can be lived out in over-responsibility, the belief that everything that goes badly in the lives of people around me is somehow my responsibility. Self-righteousness could be acted out when we become obsessive moralizers, seeing life in totally moral colors, as if everything we do has to be either right or wrong. Self-righteousness can be lived out in becoming compulsive comparers, forever comparing ourselves with successful people or others so that when they succeed, we feel that if we don't succeed, we are failures and bad people. Self-righteousness could be shown out in being an approval addict, not being able to approve of myself unless I know for sure that other people approve of me. And so I draw my self-esteem from what other people think about me. Self-righteousness can be acted out in feelings of never deserving. That when things go wrong, we feel that we deserve the consequences. But when things go well, we can't enjoy the outcome and we're miserable. Self-righteousness could be displayed in being condemned by bad memories, remembering a moment in our lives where we had harmed another person for our own advantage, and for some reason we just can't stop punishing ourselves for it. Self-righteousness can be lived out in dwelling in the shadow of our parents, that our worth as a person is based upon what our parents accomplished and what they provided for us and what they told us we were. And self-righteousness can be lived out in being condemned by our visions and dreams of what life should be like. We can feel that who we are in life is determined by what we do in our dreams and these internal conversations we always have with ourselves of would have, should have, and could have. Lewis Smedes offers this list to us as a way to think about how self-righteousness gets acted out in a crisis of spiritual meaninglessness. And as I believe that shame is at the root of the spiritual crisis of meaninglessness and is a burden heavily borne by our younger generations. There's a general distinction between the spiritual crises of a person who is older and one who is a millennial or younger. The reality of the church is that our older members are losing their common ground with our young adults. Why is this? I think the primary reason is that the spiritual crisis of a baby boomer or older is different than the spiritual crisis of a millennial or younger. Typically, older Christians focus on the spiritual need to get into heaven after they die and desiring forgiveness for the things they did wrong that they believe could keep them from getting into heaven. In addition, hidden under the language of responsibility, the older generations focus on the fear of guilt and accuse the younger generations of not taking responsibility for their lives, not being responsible, which is code language for them saying they're not feeling the same fear of guilt that we are. They're not having the same spiritual crisis as we are. There must be something wrong with them. Younger believers are suffering under the heavy burden of not believing that they're good enough. This feeling of not being good enough is called shame. Merrill Fossum writes this about shame. It's a pervasive sense of shame is the ongoing premise that one is fundamentally bad, inadequate, defective, unworthy, or not fully valued as a human being. And Lewis Smedes writes, the feeling of shame is about our very selves, not about some bad thing we did or said, but about what we are. It is us telling ourselves that we are unworthy, totally unworthy. It is not as if a few seams in the garment of ourselves need stitching. We believe the whole fabric is frayed. We feel that we are unacceptable, and to feel unacceptable is to carry a life-wearing heaviness. Smedes also writes, shame is a very heavy feeling. It is a feeling that we do not measure up, and maybe we never will measure up. It comes when no one else is looking at you but yourself, and what you see in yourself is a phony, a coward, a failure, incompetent. Shame-prone people discount their positives, magnify their flaws, judge themselves by undefined ideals, translate criticism of what they do into judgment of who they are, and read their own shame into other people's minds. The imposter syndrome is very real for those who struggle with shame. More succinctly stated, the difference between the spiritual crises of guilt and that of shame is that the crisis of guilt states, I did something bad. The crisis of shame states, I am bad. At the heart of guilt is the perception that we have done something wrong, while at the heart of shame, the perception is that we as people are wrong. So what's at the root of shame, particularly for millennials? Malcolm Harris, in his book Kids These Days, Human Capital and the Making of Millennials, claims that the primary historical trend that has an impact on millennials is the moment when capitalism emerged as a single dominant mode of organizing society. Under the aegis of capitalism, millennials become seen as investments, productive machinery, human capital. For a person to survive under capitalism, they must always be adjusting their abilities, skills, emotions, and even their sleep schedules to their role in the economy. Their survival is dependent upon performing at higher than humanly possible levels and always adapting to the needs of capitalism. It is important to note that capitalism is dependent upon performance. Those most successful at meeting the performance standards of rate, quantity, quality, and cost are perceived as having higher value than those who are not successful. So what is the impact of capitalism on shaping human worth? The first impact is that the character of childhood has changed. The purpose of childhood is future-oriented. Child-rearing, parenting styles, and the role of education are aimed at making the child and student a better candidate for the labor market. The more prepared a child is for the labor market, the more worth they are perceived as having. Ironically, millennials are worse off financially than in previous generations. And this really has an impact on their self-perception, who likely conclude that they aren't being good enough, and that's why they aren't better off. Second impact of capitalism on millennials is that schools and colleges have assumed the role of training employees for companies. This creates two problems. First, college students are saddled with enormous amounts of debt they feel is necessary to take on in order to get the skills and the practices they need to thrive in the marketplace. But they will most likely not get a job that pays them enough to easily repay that debt. So they work hard in college, but don't get the jobs that allow them to thrive financially. And when companies are not investing money themselves and training their workers, and the workers are absorbing debt to do so in college, companies have less of a commitment to keeping these employees around, letting them go more easily, which leaves the young people wondering what they did wrong, that their investment is not getting them that for which they had hoped. The third impact of capitalism is that there's a negative impact on a person who is being shaped to be considered human capital. The cost is seen in two areas, in mental health and social trust. Without the certainty of job security and earning a livable wage, millennial lives can be filled with worry, sadness, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. The use of antidepressants among this population has doubled in recent years. The other cost is that of social trust. Less than 20% of millennials think people can be trusted. Their parents have been bombarded with the questions, where are safe places for your kids? Who are the safe people for your kids to be around? What are safe practices? And Tim Gill writes, there is growing adult intervention to minimize risk at the expense of childhood experiences. The risks have been minimized, yet millennials are not finding the benefits promised them with minimized risk. As stated earlier, this failure is internalized, and they believe that they are bad because it isn't working. On a personal note, when my wife and I chose a preschool for our son, we chose the YMCA. We chose it because our son is a very active young man and was a very active toddler. The YMCA offered swimming time and gym time as well as preschool time. When we shared with others that we had enrolled him in the preschool at the YMCA, one couple said to us, "Why did you choose that preschool? Don't you want your son to get into a good college?" We start so early in shaping our children to be able to meet the capital needs of our culture. And when one is seen and sees oneself as capital, they will engage in practice, thought patterns, and spiritual disciplines to help them cope. We can call these practices, thought patterns, and spiritual disciplines religion. Robert Wuthnow describes millennials as masters at bricolage, that is, pulling resources and practices and ways of thinking from a variety of religious and other sources. You see, to have a religion is literally to be bound to something. For those who fight shame, there is a distinct religion. It is the religion of enoughness. David Zoll writes, "Our religion is that which we rely on not just for meaning or hope, but for enoughness." And this is how Zoll talks about the hunger for enoughness. We believe instinctively that, were we to reach some benchmark in our minds, then value, vindication, and love would be ours, that if we got enough, we would be enough. The spiritual lives of young adults can become less of a pilgrimage towards getting into heaven and more of a pilgrimage toward enoughness. The yearning for enoughness comes in large part from the social force of capitalism at play in their lives from their birth. In that system, millennials are perceived as a commodity. Their life value is based on their performance and capacity to produce. Their performance in each situation classifies them as valuable or disruptive. If you don't believe that young adults have been put under this pressure, consider the high level of anxiety that parents have about getting their children into the right preschool. It starts so young. Look at the pressure to do well in schools so that they can get a good job. Unfortunately, the battle for enoughness is a story of judgment. The battle for enoughness is a story of self-judgment, while the story of Jesus is a story of redemption. Throughout Scripture, there are stories about people who encounter God's presence. In that encounter, people are changed. The person after the encounter with God does not return to life as it was. From the story of Noah building the ark to Abraham and Sarah beginning their wandering lives, to Joseph in his colorful garb, to Saul, David, Solomon, to the prophets, to Mary as mother of Jesus, to the disciples, the stories about their lives show a change after their encounter with God. And also remember, none of those who encounter God and start a new chapter in their lives were perfect before, nor were they perfect after they encountered God. Of all the people who are lifted up in the world's religions and the world's religious rites, only the people in the Old Testament and New Testament are shown to be fallible and to make mistakes. I think this is a beautiful quality of our faith and our faith practices. And to hear that God still chooses to be with people, even if they make mistakes, that can be a unifying narrative that engages all humanity. The Bible gives us a story not of perfection, but of restoration. And this story of restoration is conveyed from one person to another through their storytelling. As Christians, we call this telling the story of redemption. In sharing the story of Jesus and Jesus at work in our lives, we are sharing the story of restoration and redemption. In doing that, we don't start as the perfect one trying to convert the other person to our perfection. No, in telling our stories, we become fellow pilgrims on a faith journey that is led by Jesus. So what is the connection between millennials, the church, and storytelling? Jeff Cloder answers that question. The first connection, he says, is that millennials are not strongly moved by the authoritative announcements of the church. Second, millennials regularly share their stories, and they appear to treasure when other people tell them stories. And third, the primary method of community for millennials is through shared experience. For Cloder, when the church wants to engage with millennials, it listens to stories and it tells stories. In doing so, an intersection is found between God's story, our own, and theirs. And in that moment of intersection, vitality, creativity, surprise, and life can be found. American Christianity, says Cloder, is shifting from places to people, from attractional to incarnational in nature. Buildings are not what hold millennials together. Doctrinal statements do not speak to them. It is shared experience that engages millennials, and experiences are shared through storytelling. God's story affords significance and meaning to the endless information we possess, rendering the chaotic events and episodes that once seemed unrelated. This is something that stating doctrine and speaking with reason just does not accomplish. Telling the story of Jesus and sharing our personal redemption stories create connection between people and establish a common experience. When telling the story of Jesus, we are telling others about how God loves us, treasures us, and makes us good. There is a restorative nature to the stories we tell when talking about Jesus working in our lives. Each person has a collection of stories at their disposal. These narratives include family stories, accounts of childhood adventures, coming-of-age stories, college myths, love and engagement stories, stories from work, their neighborhoods, their friendships, and growing old stories. These stories are accounts not only about a person, but also about the relationships the person has with others, with institutions, with life experiences, and with their spiritual journeys. These stories provide an important part of a person's identity. Stating the importance of stories for identity formation, Dan McAdams writes that a person's life is given unity, meaning, and purpose by having an inner story. His definition of a life story is that which provides a moral frame of reference because it grounds your experiences in basic values and beliefs. This moral framework aids a person in determining what is right or wrong, good or bad, beautiful or ugly. Without a narrative identity, a person's life is seen as what McAdams calls episodic. Life is as episodic as a concept developed by McAdams. He describes life that is episodic as one where a person lives in the moment. Living in the moment, a person lacks self-awareness, does not reflect on the past, thus does not learn from experience. Being in the moment sees the present as one more argument or war to have and win. One moment does not appear to have a connection to the next moments. So there is minimal, if any, growth in the person. The person is typically lacking maturity. Moving from battlefield to battlefield, a person living in the moment does not gain experience and perspective from the previous moment. Living in the moment, according to McAdams, is when one is compulsively in the present. Having an inner story that is episodic leads a person to identify truth as that which works at a particular time to help them win the moment. Truth doesn't have to be a fact. Truth is simply that which helps them win. Each moment stands alone, so no consistency is seen between one's actions at one moment to one's actions at the next moment. A person's value is believed to be based on success in each episode of life. In opposition to an episodic understanding of one's life, McAdams proposes that we consider a narrative understanding of our lives. A narrative understanding is to believe that the experience of one moment applies to the next and applies to each new experience. It is to grow and gain perspective that aids living in the next moment. So for over 20 years, McAdams has been working with his students to study a particular kind of narrative story he calls a redemption story. Redemption stories are stories of overcoming suffering or adversity. And research has shown that those who have more themes of redemption in their story are healthier and happier. They believe themselves to be more whole and more complete and good. For those who do not have as many moments of redemption in their lives, there are health problems and lower levels of happiness. Additionally, research has shown strong associations between redemptive life stories and an adult's concern for the well-being of other generations. With a narrative that includes redemption, a person is more likely to act in ways that are moral and more likely to have a concern for those other generations. So here's a simple test to determine if your life is shaped by redemption stories. Ask yourselves these questions. In the stories that I tell others about myself, am I always the hero? In my stories, am I the one who is always right? And are the others the ones who are always wrong? And in these stories, am I the one who is always misunderstood? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, I hope you can find yourself in a place where you become aware of your brokenness and the need for redemption, to hear once again the story of Jesus. Redemption comes only through Jesus' death and resurrection. This is at the heart of the story we tell of Jesus acting in our lives. In our stories, then, we show more humble humility than hubris. We do this because we believe our life story is written into the story of Jesus' resurrection. So in telling the story of Jesus' act in our lives, we are not telling stories where we are always the hero. We are not telling stories where we are the one who is always right. And we are not telling stories where we are the one who's always misunderstood. In our storytelling, as we talk about Jesus, and His presence in our lives, we are daring to speak grace to those living in shame. Being graceful and grace-filled doesn't come naturally to us. So we need to find wisdom and have guidance on who we are to understand who we are, our situations, and to honor others. So here's some wisdom on being grace-filled and gracious to others. Lewis Smedes says, learn how to make a distinction between feeling guilt and feeling shame, and to know the difference between the two. Make a distinction between feeling embarrassed, which happens to all of us, and feeling shame, which is a chronic part of who we are. Make a distinction between feeling discouraged, which we can all find ourselves to be, and feeling shame. And make a distinction between being depressed, which requires professional help and medication, and feeling shame. Another piece of wisdom is to understand that telling a person they are forgiven when they haven't done anything wrong is like putting a millstone around their neck and throwing them into the sea. So please strive to understand where the person is on their spiritual journey. And they may not be in a crisis of guilt. They might be in a crisis of shame. And so speaking words of forgiveness don't speak to the heart of their crisis. How do we determine where they are in the spiritual journey? Well, to be quite obvious, that means listening before we talk. Another piece of wisdom is learning not to accuse those of feeling shame as failing to feel guilty, as if feeling guilty is a higher spiritual plane, or that feeling guilty will take away the shame. I have read articles where authors accuse millennials of not feeling guilty and offers up the solution that if they would just learn how to feel guilty, then they could also experience the grace of God. To do so states that the spiritual struggle of guilt is a more noble struggle than the spiritual struggle against shame. And this is not true. Accusing others of not feeling guilty is our own self-justification. It's not a word of grace. And anytime we tell another that if they were like us, believed like us, and thought like us, they would be happy, well, we're just sinning. Another piece of wisdom is to challenge the fallacy of I did, therefore I am. A broader understanding of salvation is to share the blessed news that we are more than our successes and failures. So even if we succeed, that doesn't mean that we are a good person. If we fail, it does not mean that we are a bad person. We are a child loved by God no matter whether we succeed or fail. I think at the heart of the gospel belief is this next piece of wisdom. Believe that the life force of God can overcome the death force of shame. Lewis Smedes brings this out in his book, that when we are overcome by shame, we don't think there's anything out there that's more powerful than that. But my brothers and sisters, I contend that the power and force of God can always overwhelm even those who are overwhelmed by shame. It is a piece of wisdom to challenge these arbitrary norms that are narrowly defined, which, when not lived up to, trigger shame and our shame responses. These arbitrary norms are horrible accusing voices that severely limit our capacity to expand our horizons and see the beauty and magnificence of who we are in the world in which we live. Arbitrary assumptions create a false self and a false world, an image of what we ought to be that is concocted out of false ideals. It is wisdom to redefine what it means when we say God's eyes are upon us. Have you ever seen one of those pictures of Jesus, and no matter where you walk, his eyes are following you? And too often we as Christians, when we talk about God's eyes being upon us, it's God looking at us, waiting for us to make a mistake and accuse us and judge us. But Smedes asks us to consider this. What if it means when we say God's eyes are upon us, what is captured in the song, God's eye is on the sparrow? That God will not even let a sparrow fall from the sky without knowing it and treasuring it and loving it. It's that kind of God that can speak to those who are battling shame. Wisdom encourages us to find a person whose grace puts us in touch with a beauty in ourselves that we would have not felt without it. My long-term mentor and friend, Frank, always referred to me as his boy, even though I was an adult. But I never minded it because it was a term of endearment. And this term of endearment meant the world to me, because it reminded me that he saw a goodness in me that I hadn't seen yet. But once he pointed it out, I started noticing it and looking for it too. Wisdom tells us to strive for a way to have a healthier sense of self, where we can acknowledge that there are things we do wrong, or that when we fail, this is not a statement of our worth as a person. It's simply that as human beings, we succeed and we fail. It is wisdom to turn to the power of belief in the incarnation of Jesus as God in our lives. That Jesus comes to be with us, and we wait for his return to come to be with us. And he's coming to be with us, not just to be with the parts of us that we see as good and are acceptable to him, but he comes to be with us that is all of who we are. And sometimes the parts of ourselves that we see as bad, when Jesus looks at us, we realize that they're good as well. Wisdom allows us to find grace shown in secular moments and places, and to find people of grace even in the secular world like good counselors. At the same time, to believe that ultimate grace is specific to the death of Jesus on the cross and what he accomplishes for all of us. And a final word of wisdom: be cautious about blaming yourself for what other people have done to you. That when someone does something bad or wrong to you, you want to believe there must be something wrong with you that made that person do it. And that's not true. Many times people will do things to us that are hurtful and harmful because they too are broken, and not because we are a bad person. So where, when, and how do these powerful and gracious encounters happen? First, they will most likely happen outside the building of the church, and they will be contextual. Look at how Paul in the marketplace, making tents in the marketplace, talks about Jesus as he works. Second, these powerful and gracious encounters begin when we build relationships which require longevity, persistence, and patience. Third, they don't require a prepared speech or some doctrinal or theological statement. In fact, that can scare people away faster than anything. They require having a conversation. And remember this, conversations always include significant amounts of listening. They ask us to tell stories of our faith and how we have seen and believe that God is at work in the world, not pointing out about how good we have been all the time, but how even when we struggle, God is still with us and loving us and giving us grace and goodness. They understand the differences of the spiritual crisis that we talked about earlier in this podcast. In having a good, faithful conversation with another person, it means trying to understand and learn where their spiritual crisis is. And finally, they know at times when to suspend logic, because sometimes logic can't help. Recently, in talking with a friend whose husband committed suicide, this friend was trying to understand what went wrong and to rationalize and figure it out. And I remembered what a good counselor once told me, that in matters of suicide, you have to suspend logic because it's not going to help. There is the unknown, there's the mysterious, there's the beautiful, and there's the horrible. And sometimes logic just can't help us understand that. But know this, that God's eyes are upon you and looking at you with love and goodness and mercy and grace, because you are treasured and valued in God's eyes.
This is Pastor Rebecca Great, the media ambassador and storyteller for the Southern Ohio Synod. And I want to thank you again for joining us for this podcast episode. There is a discussion guide available for this podcast that is located on the Synod's website and in the description box for this episode on our YouTube channel. We hope this helps congregations and ministries be able to use this information with your councils and your other ministry leaders to help us all grow in our discipleship. If you have questions about any of the content or want to continue the conversation, you can connect with Pastor Tim Mentzer by sending him an email. His email address is tmentzer@southernohiosynod.org. Until the next time we gather on this podcast, remember that we are stronger and better together, joining Jesus in the restoration of the world.